In today's video, we're taking these sub $400 DIY speakers from a box on your doorstep to a pair of speakers ready to rock. We'll build them from the ground up, upgrade the crossover, give them a finish that's anything but ordinary, and then put them to the test with some of our favorite tracks. Let's find out if these speakers can really compete with speakers carrying a price tag 10 times higher. So this is what the HiVi 3.1 kit looks like when it actually shows up at your doorstep. It's a fairly large box. The first thing I noticed is just how well packaged everything is. And honestly, with a speaker kit like this, that's pretty important. You're dealing with some fairly large and fairly delicate components, especially the drivers, so you don't want everything just bouncing around inside a box during shipping. This foam you see on top is what we're going to actually use for our dampening material inside the box, so we'll make sure we set that aside and save that for later. It's very thick. So a better top-down view we can see here. We got our beauty rings for the woofers that are made out of aluminum. We got our ports, some cabinet accessories, such as mounting points and stuff for the crossover. We got our 5-way binding post terminal cups, more cabinet accessories, and then all of our drivers. This is going to be one of the mids. And then these are our woofers, and then our tweeters. And then in the second box here is where they actually package the cabinet itself. And we're following the same theme here. It's very well packaged. Each piece of wood is individually wrapped as well, which is a nice touch to see. And you'll notice that all the cabinet pieces are actually cut at 45-degree angles, which makes assembling the cabinet relatively easy, as well as hiding any seams. Now let's take a quick look at the crossover components that come with the kit. We've got some decent quality HiVi branded foam capacitors, along with one electrolytic capacitor, sandcast resistors, a couple of air core inductors, and an iron core inductor. The kit also includes the crossover PCBs, which gives you a nice clean way to mount and solder all of these components together. Everything you need to build the stock crossover is included right here. Now I'm going to be making some modifications to this stock crossover, however I'll make sure to go over that in great detail later in this video. For now, let's move on to the rest of the assembly. Now let's take a closer look at the wood that's included in the kit. The cabinets are made from 3/4 MDF, which gives us a nice solid foundation for the speakers. Just like I mentioned earlier, each individual piece is wrapped in protective plastic to help prevent scratches and dents and other damage during shipping. Everything is cut to size and ready to go, so there's not a whole lot of measuring and cutting that we have to do ourselves. One thing I'm definitely going to be doing differently though is adding a 3/8 inch roundover to the internal bracing. The braces are designed to add rigidity to the cabinet, but adding the roundover will also help smooth out edges and allow air to move through the bracing more freely. You can see the roundover I did here. Once again, that's a 3/8 inch roundover. It's a small modification, but it's something I wanted to do while I have everything apart. Now we're moving on to the assembly of the cabinet. I've got all the panels laid out in the order and orientation that I plan on assembling them. Before I start gluing anything together, I'm using masking tape temporarily to hold the pieces together. The idea here is pretty simple. Once everything is taped up, I can apply wood glue to the joints and the entire cabinet can basically fold together like a puzzle to form the cabinet structure. This is a really useful technique because it lets you dry fit everything first and make sure all the pieces are oriented correctly before committing to glue. And that's especially important with this build because you want to pay close attention to the orientation of each panel. It's very easy to accidentally flip a piece around and end up with something like the port opening or binding post cups mounted upside down. So before applying any glue, double check the front, back, top, and bottom panels, as well as all locations of the cutouts. I also recommend doing a complete dry fit before gluing. Make sure the panels sit flush. Check the braces are going in the correct locations. and make sure nothing is interfering with the driver's opening or internal components. Once I'm happy with everything, I'll start applying the wood glue. You don't need to go crazy with the glue. You want enough to get good coverage along the mating surfaces, but not so much that you're creating a huge mess inside the cabinet. Then it's just a matter of folding everything together, getting the panels aligned, and clamping everything securely while the glue cures. I'm using cheap box clamps, 4 of them in total, to secure the cabinet in place. I found these for cheap on Amazon, but you can use almost any clamp to do this job as well. The kit does include all of the hardware needed to make and mount the speaker grills. However, I'm going for a slightly cleaner look with this build, so I'm going to be doing things a little bit differently. Instead of using traditional grill mounting hardware, I'm going to be installing neodymium magnets into the existing grill holes. I'll then use a little wood filler to cover the tops of the magnets and blend everything into the cabinet. Once everything is finished and painted, the magnets will be completely hidden. This gives us a nice clean mounting connection without having visible grill hardware sticking out of the front of the speaker. The grills will still be removable when I need them to be, but when they're installed, the mounting system will basically disappear into the cabinet. Next, I'm taking the cabinets outside so I can give all of the edges a 3/8 inch round over. I'm doing this on all of the outside edges of the cabinet to give the finished speakers a cleaner, more refined look. And just to clarify, this round over is strictly for aesthetic purposes. The 3/8 inch radius isn't large enough to provide any meaningful improvement in baffle diffraction. So I'm not really expecting it to have an audible effect on the speaker's response. At this stage, it's mainly about making the cabinets look more finished and professional once they're painted. I'll run the router around each edge, making sure to keep the cuts consistent and clean. After that, we'll sand everything smooth and get the cabinets ready for the next stage of finishing. Really quick, I wanted to show you what each cabinet looks like now that we've got all the edges rounded over. I think the 3/8 inch roundover really starts to make these look more like finished speakers rather than just a bunch of MDF panels. Next, I'm moving on to sanding down the wood filler we used earlier to cover the neo magnets. This part of the process is obviously sped up for the video, but in reality, I'm taking my time here and using a very light sanding motion. I'm using 240 grit sandpaper and slowly working the filler down until it completely is flush with the surrounding MDF. You really don't want to get too aggressive with this step. The goal is to remove the excess filler without sanding down the surrounding wood. Once everything is smooth and I can no longer feel the transition between the filler and the cabinet, we're ready to move on to the next step. Before moving on to the next step, I quickly wanted to check the magnet strength for our speaker grills. Alright, this next part of the process can be a little tedious, but it's an important step before we get to painting. I'm going around each cabinet and taping off all of the openings, including the driver cutouts, ports, and any other surfaces that I don't want to get paint into. It takes a little bit of time, but getting these areas properly masked now will save a lot of cleanup later. I also want to make sure the tape is pressed down firmly around the edges of each opening so we get a nice, clean lines once the paint goes on. Once everything is taped up and protected, the cabinets are finally ready for paint. Now it's time to get these cabinets painted. I'm starting off with a couple coats of Duratex, which is a rugged, textured cabinet finish that you can pick up from Parts Express. You typically see Duratex used in black, especially on professional style speaker cabinets, but since I'm going to be painting over it, I decided to go with white. Once the Duratex has dried and I've got a nice even base coat, I can move on to the actual color. For the main color, I went with Rust-Oleum Safety Red Enamel. I ended up applying 3 coats in total, which is used pretty much an entire can of spray paint between the 2 cabinets. Once the red was finished, I decided to have a little fun with the finish. I added a marble effect using Rust-Oleum's white and black marble spray paints. This is definitely not going to be everyone's cup of tea, but that's part of the fun of doing a DIY build like this. I'm not necessarily trying to make these look like something that came straight off a factory production line. I wanted to experiment and create something that's a little different and reflects my own style. And finally, once I was happy with the finish, I sealed everything with a matte clear coat. This gives the cabinet some protection and knocks down some of the gloss while keeping the texture and marble effect intact. And with the paint finally finished, these cabinets are starting to look like actual speakers. Earlier in the video, we took a quick look at the crossover components that come with this kit. A lot of people are perfectly happy with the sound of the stock crossover, but to my ears, I find the HiVi 3.1 to be a little bright, especially in the tweeter. So for this build, I decided to go with the Perfectionist crossover modification. You can find all the information about this modification online. Real quick, before we dive in, I wanted to show you the exact website I'm referencing for the crossover modification. Before we get into components, there's a few key points I want to touch on from Scott's notes. First, you'll notice Scott mentions that when he originally measured the woofer, his test leads had the polarity reversed. So when you're looking at XM schematics on your screen, you can completely ignore the flipped positive and negative markings on the woofer. In practice, you'll want to connect the woofer with the exact same standard polarity as the mid-range and tweeter, positive to positive, negative to negative. Scott provided 6 different crossover options on his site, but since we're building option 4, also known as the Perfectionist mod, we're going to scroll right down to it. For option 4, Scott completely reworked the tweeter section with all new components. He swapped in a 0.15 millihenry inductor, a 1.5 microfarad capacitor, a 5.6 resistor, and a 2 microfarad capacitor. For the mid-range, he tightened up the 1 to 2 kilohertz region by dropping the stock 6.8 microfarad capacitor down to 5.6 microfarad. And on the woofer circuit, he updated the resistor to 2 ohm. Looking at the simulated frequency response on the right, you can see how much flatter and smoother this curve is compared to stock. It really cleans up the entire spectrum. Crossover component prices will fluctuate, but at the time of me filming this, you can grab everything you need for the Perfectionist mod from Parts Express for right around $29 plus shipping. I won't get too deep into the weeds here, but for any audio enthusiast watching, it's worth mentioning that Scott actually sent his personal pair with the Perfectionist mod installed over to Amir at Audio Science Review. It was measured on a state-of-the-art Klippel system, and you can check out all the full measurement graphs in his review. And I'll leave a link down in the description if you want to read more about the design and the changes it makes. The cool thing about this modification is that you can actually build it using the stock crossover PCB that comes with the kit. But I decided to take it a step further and design my own PCB specifically for this modified crossover. This gives me a lot more room to work with, which allows me to use some higher quality components throughout the crossover. For example, I'm using all air core inductors instead of the iron core inductor that comes with the kit, and I'm also replacing the electrolytic cap with the film capacitor. It's definitely more work than simply building the stock crossover, but since I'm already putting all this time into the rest of the speaker, I figured I might as well go the extra mile with the crossover too. And we'll see if all these modifications make a difference once we get the speakers hooked up and start listening. To make assembling the crossover a little easier, I grabbed a scrap piece of cardboard and made myself a quick reference guide. I wrote down all of the component values and their locations within the crossover network. That way, while I'm gluing and positioning everything onto the PCB, I can quickly reference where each component goes without constantly having to look back at the schematic. It's a pretty simple thing, but it makes the assembly process a lot easier and helps prevent accidentally putting a component in the wrong location. I didn't have any 2 microfarad capacitors on hand for the crossover, so I used a simple workaround. Instead, I'm taking 2 1 microfarad capacitors and wiring them in parallel, which gives me that 2 microfarad value that I need. Once they're wired together, I'll secure the 2 capacitors and mount them to the PCB just like a single 2 microfarad capacitor. It's a pretty simple solution and a good way to make use of components that I already had on hand. Now I'm just continuing to place each component in its correct location on the crossover PCB. I'm using that reference guide I made earlier to double check the values and make sure everything is going where it belongs. Once I have each component positioned correctly, I'm securing them to the PCB with a little hot glue to keep everything in place. After all of the components are located and glued down, we'll be ready to move on to soldering everything together. Here's a quick look at the completed crossover now that everything has been glued down and positioned in the correct place. You can also get a better idea of just how much larger this crossover is compared to the original design. With the larger air core inductors and upgraded capacitors, there's quite a bit more going on here. So taking the time to get everything organized before makes the soldering process much easier. Before I start soldering, I'm going to apply a little flux to each of the soldering points. The flux helps the solder flow more easily and creates a cleaner connection between the component leads and the PCB. It also makes it easier to get the solder to properly wet the connection without having to spend as much time heating the joint. So with all of the solder points prepped, we're ready to finally start soldering everything together. For attaching the speaker wire to the crossover PCB, I designed the board to accept 5mm pitch screw down terminals. I really like this approach because it makes any future crossover work much easier. If I ever need to replace a wire, troubleshoot the crossover, or make another modification down the road, I can simply loosen the terminals to remove the wires without having to desolder anything from the PCB. To install the terminals, I'm following the same basic process as the other components. I'll apply a little bit of flux to the solder points and then solder each terminal securely into place. Once those are installed, the crossover is ready to accept all the wiring we'll need to connect it to the drivers and the speaker terminals. For mounting the crossover inside the cabinet, I decided to use PCB standoff mounts that I picked up from Amazon. These will allow me to securely mount the crossover to the inside of the cabinet while keeping the PCB elevated away from the MDF. Another advantage is that the crossover can still be removed fairly easily if I ever need to service it or make changes in the future. So instead of permanently gluing the crossover into the cabinet, we've got a secure mounting solution that's also serviceable, which is exactly what I wanted for this build. Now I'm finally connecting the speaker wire to those terminals I showed you a few seconds ago. I'm using 16 gauge blue and black speaker wire that I picked up from Parts Express. I'm using the different colors to help keep track of polarity and make the wiring a little easier to follow. For each connection, I'm first cutting the wire to the appropriate length, then stripping a small section of the insulation from the end. From there, I simply insert the bare wire into the screw down terminal and tighten the screw to securely clamp the wire in place. It's a pretty straightforward process, but I'm taking my time here to make sure each wire is connected to the correct terminal and that the connections are nice and secure. Once all of the wires are connected, we'll have everything we need to start installing the crossover inside the cabinet. The stock binding post terminal cups are perfectly fine for this build, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with using them. But at this point, I've already upgraded quite a bit of the speaker, so I figured a little more can't hurt, right? I decided to upgrade the binding post as well. I picked up these solid aluminum binding post plates from Parts Express, along with a set of new binding posts from JF Components. I'll put a link to JF Components down in the description for anyone who's interested. He's got a lot of really cool DIY speaker components and hardware available on his website. Before tightening everything down, I'm making sure each binding post is oriented correctly and that the positive and negative terminals are in the proper positions. Once I'm happy with the orientation, I'll tighten down the nut on the back of each post to securely mount them to the aluminum plate. It's a pretty simple upgrade, but I think these look a lot cleaner and more substantial than the stock terminal cups, which are just made of cheap plastic. And they fit nicely with the rest of the upgrades I've made to this build. Installing the ports is really easy with this kit. You simply line them up with the opening and press them into place by hand. You may find it a little easier to use a rubber mallet like I'm doing here, just to make sure they're fully seated and sitting flush with the cabinet. Once the ports are installed, I'm moving on to wiring up the binding post. I'm making a couple short jumper leads that will connect the two sets of binding posts together in parallel, so positive to positive and negative to negative. This allows both sets of binding posts to carry the same signal, which gives me some flexibility for how I want to use them down the road. I'll connect these jumpers to the appropriate inputs on the crossover PCB, then get everything mounted into the cabinet. For now, these speakers are going to be sitting on traditional speaker stands, but I actually have bigger plans for them. In the future, I want to build a pair of dual subwoofer towers specifically for these speakers. The idea is for the subwoofer cabinets to double as stands, bringing the speakers up to the proper listening height while also giving me a much larger low-end frequency foundation. And when I eventually build those, that extra set of binding posts will have another purpose. I'll be able to use them to send the high-level signal to the plate amplifiers powering the subwoofers. So even though those extra terminals aren't necessary for the current setup, I'm building in a little flexibility now for where the system is eventually going. You can see that I've drawn out all of the proper dimensions for the dampening material and labeled each section. HiVi actually used to provide a diagram showing you exactly how the damping material should be cut and positioned inside the cabinet. I'll try to provide a link to that down in the description for anyone who wants to reference it. Next, I'm going to use a sharp razor to carefully cut each section of dampening material to the correct size. Once each piece is cut, I'll sort everything into its corresponding section so I know exactly where each piece goes when it's time to install it. Once I've got everything cut and organized, I'll start installing it inside the cabinet. The material fits really nicely into the cabinet and holds itself in place, so there's no additional adhesive needed. This makes the installation pretty straightforward, and it also means the dampening material can be removed or repositioned later if necessary. With all of the sections installed in their proper locations, the inside of the cabinet is finally starting to come together. Now it's finally time to start installing the drivers into the cabinet. I'll start with the tweeter, then move on to the mid-range, and finally install the woofer. Before tightening anything down, it's really important to double check your wiring and make sure each driver is connected with the correct polarity. Once the drivers are screwed into the cabinet, getting back in there to correct a wiring mistake can be a real pain. So this is definitely one of those steps where it's worth taking an extra minute to verify everything. The screws that came with the kit will work, but I personally found them a little shorter than I would have liked. For this build, I picked up some 1-inch screws from Parts Express instead. The extra length gives me a little more bite into the MDF and makes mounting the drivers feel more secure. You can actually see why that extra length is useful shortly when I install the beauty rings around the woofer. Before tightening the screws completely, I'm also making sure each driver is sitting evenly in its cutout and that the frame is properly aligned. I want to tighten the screws gradually and evenly rather than cranking one screw all the way down at once. That helps keep the driver frame seated flat against the cabinet and prevents putting unnecessary stress on the frame. And one last thing I like to do before calling the installation finished is give each connection a quick inspection and make sure none of the wiring is loose or able to rattle against the cabinet. Once everything is checked over, the drivers are securely mounted and we're one step closer to finally hearing these things make some noise. And finally, here are the finished results. Seeing these fully put together after all that soldering and cabinet assembly is incredibly satisfying. The drivers look great mounted in the enclosure. The Perfectionist mod crossovers are tucked neatly inside, and overall the build came together really smoothly. Building these is one thing, but the real test is how they actually perform in the room, especially with that Perfectionist crossover mod smoothing out the top end and the mid response. So let's stop talking about them and actually listen to them. I've got these wired up and ready to go. Now keep in mind, due to YouTube copyright restrictions, I can't play well-known commercial tracks here in the main video, but I still want to give you a quick taste of how this Perfectionist mod handles clarity, balance, and imaging. If you really want to hear what these speakers are capable of, I recorded a completely standalone, high-quality sound demo video that I have linked right down in the description. I highly recommend checking that out after this if you're interested. For now, let's fire up a quick track so you can hear these in action.
Late night scrolling, no one calling. Mine keeps falling. Still I'm stalling. Lost identity in your energy. No reply to me. What's left of me? No reply. I'm losing me in your silence. I can't breathe. Say my name. Bring me back. Without you, I fade to black. Late night scrolling, no one calling. Mine keeps falling. Still I'm stalling. Lost identity in your energy. No reply to me. What's left of me? No reply. I'm losing me in your silence. I can't breathe. Say my name. Bring me back. Without you, I fade to black.
So in conclusion, overall, I couldn't be happier with how these turned out. Listening to them in person, the soundstage and imaging are absolutely fantastic. Instruments sit right where they should, and the top end is smooth without being fatiguing. They handle power exceptionally well, and even when you push them, the distortion stays impressively low. At any price point, these drivers and cabinets offer an incredible listening experience. But for under $400 all in, including the Perfectionist mod we tackled in this video, they're an absolute steal. If you enjoy this build and want to see more DIY audio projects, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. I've got plenty more speaker builds and audio tests planned for the future. I'd love to hear from you guys in the comments below. If you've ever built the Swan 3.1 kit, which crossover mod did you go with? Or what speaker project should I tackle next? Thanks for watching. Check out the full sound demo linked below, and until next time, take it easy.